"Ma'am, the employee entrance is around the back." The comment was followed by a burst of laughter that echoed through the bright corporate lobby. A few employees looked up from their phones. Others exchanged amused glances before returning to their conversations. Standing in the center of the polished marble floor, Nyla Prescott paused for only a second. The dark blue jacket she wore was neat but plainly made. Her shoes were comfortable rather than fashionable. The canvas tote bag resting on her shoulder looked more practical than expensive. To the people watching her, she did not resemble someone important. She looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. Near the reception desk, another employee smirked. "Maybe she is here for a maintenance interview." More laughter followed. The sound bounced off the glass walls surrounding the 40-story headquarters. Nyla simply looked toward the elevators. Her expression never changed. That calm reaction somehow made the jokes continue. People often expected embarrassment. Silence made them uncomfortable. A young analyst whispered something to a coworker, and both struggled to hide their amusement. Nearby, Courtney Hale stood with a tablet in her hands, observing everything. As the office operations manager, she considered herself the unofficial gatekeeper of the company. She knew every executive, every department head, and every important visitor. At least she believed she did. When her eyes settled on Nyla, she immediately reached a conclusion. Not based on information, not based on facts, based on appearance. "Can I help you?" Courtney asked with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Nyla returned the smile. "I am looking for the executive conference room." Several employees overheard the response. One of them laughed again. Courtney glanced briefly toward the group before looking back at Nyla. "The executive conference room is restricted access." The words sounded professional, but the meaning underneath them was unmistakable. "You do not belong here." Nyla nodded gently. "I understand." Courtney folded her arms. "Do you have an appointment?" Before Nyla could answer, the elevator display above the lobby doors changed numbers as it slowly descended from the upper floors. Nobody noticed except Nyla. Everyone else remained focused on the woman they assumed had entered the wrong building. What none of them realized was that within minutes, every person standing in that lobby would wish they had been paying attention to something else. One manager would replay this moment in her head for years. An entire leadership team would be forced to confront the difference between appearance and value. And the woman standing quietly beneath the morning sunlight would become the last person anyone expected to lead the company. If stories about dignity, justice, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe to the channel and share where you are watching from today. Because what happened inside this building began with a laugh and ended with a lesson nobody would forget. 15 minutes earlier, Nyla Prescott stepped out of a rideshare vehicle beneath a clear morning sky, adjusted the strap of her canvas tote bag, and walked toward the headquarters where her very first day was about to begin. 15 minutes earlier, the headquarters tower rose above the city skyline like a monument of glass and steel, reflecting the bright morning sun across neighboring buildings. Nyla Prescott stood on the sidewalk for a moment before crossing the street toward the main entrance. Employees streamed into the building carrying coffee cups, laptop bags, and conversations about meetings waiting for them upstairs. Nobody paid attention to the woman walking among them. That was something Nyla had experienced for most of her life. People often notice status before character. They notice labels before values. She had learned long ago not to take it personally. Her phone vibrated softly inside her tote bag. A message from the chairman appeared on the screen. "Looking forward to seeing you this morning. The board is excited." Nyla smiled. She slipped the phone away and continued walking. Despite years of executive leadership, she still felt a quiet sense of responsibility whenever she entered a new organization. Becoming chief executive officer was not about power to her. It was about stewardship. Thousands of employees depended on decisions made inside that building. Families depended on those employees. Communities depended on those families. Leadership carried weight. She never forgot that. As she approached the revolving doors, she passed a window reflecting her image. The reflection looked almost identical to the woman she had been years earlier. No designer labels. No luxury accessories. No attempt to impress strangers. Her mother had worked 2 jobs for most of Nyla's childhood. One lesson stayed with her forever. Never spend energy proving your worth to people who only understand appearances. Spend that energy becoming someone worth remembering. Inside the lobby, sunlight poured through massive glass walls and spread across polished marble floors. Digital displays highlighted company achievements. Employees crossed the open space in every direction. The headquarters projected success from every angle. Yet Nyla noticed something else. Most people moved quickly without making eye contact. Some looked stressed. Others looked exhausted. A few seemed invisible despite standing in crowded spaces. Those details mattered to her. Culture often revealed itself in small moments long before it appeared in reports and presentations. Near the reception area, a maintenance worker struggled to maneuver a cart through a narrow opening beside a decorative display. Several employees walked past without noticing. Nyla immediately stepped forward and held the glass door open. "Thank you," the worker said. Nyla smiled. Of course. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Nobody else seemed to notice. Yet moments like that had always guided her leadership philosophy. The most important people inside a company were not necessarily the ones occupying corner offices. As she continued toward the elevator bank, conversations floated through the lobby. Discussions about quarterly goals, client presentations, department budgets. The familiar language of corporate life surrounded her. Somewhere above, an executive conference room waited. In less than an hour, she would be formally introduced as the company's new chief executive officer. Most employees had never seen her photograph. The board preferred to announce leadership transitions in person. Nyla had agreed. She believed first impressions should happen face to face. Looking back, she would later find that decision almost ironic. Because at that very moment, several people inside the building were already forming impressions of her. Impressions based on a jacket, a tote bag, a pair of practical shoes. And before the morning ended, those assumptions would become the center of a lesson the entire company would remember. Courtney Hale liked being the person who knew everything first. She knew which executives arrived before sunrise and which ones appeared 5 minutes before meetings. She knew who received promotions, who was interviewing for new positions, and which departments quietly competed with one another behind polished presentations and professional smiles. Over the years, that knowledge had given her influence. Officially, she managed office operations. Unofficially, many employees viewed her as the gatekeeper to the executive floor. This morning was especially important. The company was preparing to introduce its new chief executive officer. Rumors had circulated for weeks. Some employees expected a famous industry veteran. Others expected someone from a major consulting firm. Nobody knew for certain. Courtney enjoyed that uncertainty because it placed her at the center of countless conversations. Standing near the reception area with a digital tablet in her hands, she watched employees move through the lobby beneath the bright morning sunlight. Glass walls reflected the city skyline outside while elevator doors opened and closed in a steady rhythm. Everywhere she looked, people seemed energized by curiosity. "Have you heard anything?" a marketing manager asked as he approached her. Courtney smiled knowingly. Only that the board spent months finding the right person. The answer revealed almost nothing, which made it more effective. People often mistook confidence for information. As another group gathered nearby, the conversation shifted toward leadership. One employee mentioned innovation. Another mentioned profitability. A third discussed company culture. Courtney listened while silently judging each opinion. She believed leadership looked a certain way. Executive presence mattered. Appearance mattered. Confidence mattered. First impressions mattered most of all. It was a belief she rarely questioned because it had shaped her understanding of success for years. When the revolving doors opened and Nyla entered the lobby, Courtney noticed her immediately. Not because she recognized her. Because she did not. The practical clothing. The canvas tote bag. The absence of any visible symbols of status. Within seconds, Courtney placed her into a category. Visitor. Contractor. Job applicant. Certainly not someone connected to the executive team. That conclusion felt obvious to her. Nearby employees reached similar conclusions just as quickly. Human beings often filled gaps in knowledge with assumptions. The process happened so fast most people never noticed it occurring. Courtney certainly did not. She simply trusted her instincts. As Nyla moved through the lobby, Courtney continued observing. Something about the woman's calmness stood out. Most visitors entering a corporate headquarters for the first time appeared uncertain. Nyla did not. She walked with quiet confidence, occasionally studying the building around her as though she were evaluating more than architecture. Courtney interpreted that confidence as misplaced familiarity. Another employee glanced toward Nyla and smirked. Looks like somebody took the wrong elevator from the parking garage. A few co-workers laughed softly. Courtney did not join the laughter, but neither did she stop it. Instead she watched, judged, assumed. Above them, an elevator descended from the executive floors carrying someone whose arrival would soon change everything. But in the lobby below, nobody noticed the numbers counting downward. Their attention remained fixed on the woman they believed did not belong. And with every passing second, the gap between perception and reality grew wider. Nyla stopped near the reception area and looked toward a directory display mounted beside the elevator bank. The executive conference room was listed on the 38th floor. Around her, employees continued arriving for work, their conversations blending into a steady corporate soundtrack of deadlines, presentations, and quarterly targets. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass walls and reflected across the marble floor in bright patterns. Everything about the headquarters communicated success. Yet Nyla had learned years ago that the true character of an organization revealed itself long before anyone entered a boardroom. It revealed itself in ordinary interactions, in the way people treated strangers, in the way they spoke when they believed nobody important was listening. As she studied the directory, Courtney approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Several employees nearby immediately paid attention. Courtney smiled politely. "Can I help you find someone?" Nyla returned the courtesy. "Thank you. I am looking for the executive conference room." Courtney glanced briefly at the tote bag hanging from Nyla's shoulder, then at her practical shoes, then back to her face. The judgment happened in seconds. The executive conference room is reserved for leadership meetings. Nyla nodded. "I understand." Courtney waited for additional explanation. None came. That somehow made the situation more awkward. Nearby, a few employees slowed their pace to listen. One whispered something to another, earning a quiet laugh. Nyla noticed but chose not to react. Her attention remained on Courtney. "Do you have an appointment with someone upstairs?" Courtney asked. "Yes," Nyla replied. "You could say that." The answer was technically true. It was also far less information than Courtney wanted. She folded her arms. "The executive floor requires authorization." Another employee passing nearby glanced toward Nyla and smirked. "Maybe she is interviewing for a support position." A couple of people laughed softly. The comment floated through the lobby. Nyla heard it clearly. So did Courtney. Neither corrected it. For a brief moment, the only sound came from the elevators opening and closing at the far end of the building. Nyla remained calm. Years of leadership had taught her that people often revealed more about themselves than they did about the person they were judging. Courtney interpreted that calmness differently. To her it looked like confusion. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," she said. Employee orientation takes place in another building. More smiles appeared among the small audience gathering nearby. One young analyst lowered his eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Others seemed entertained. Nyla simply adjusted the strap of her tote bag. "I appreciate your concern." The response felt almost unsettling in its composure. Courtney expected defensiveness. Instead, she encountered patience. That patience only reinforced her confidence that she was handling the situation correctly. Above the lobby, the elevator carrying Graham Whitmore continued descending floor by floor. Inside, the chairman reviewed notes for the company's leadership announcement. He had no idea what was happening below. In the lobby, however, assumptions were hardening into certainty. Employees who had never spoken to Nyla had already decided who she was. Courtney had already decided where she belonged. And as the elevator numbers continued counting downward toward the ground floor, the distance between what everyone believed and the truth waiting behind those doors grew smaller with every passing second. The laughter spread a little farther across the lobby. What had started as a few comments had now become a source of quiet entertainment for several employees gathering near the reception area. Some pretended to focus on their phones while listening closely. Others exchanged knowing smiles. Nyla stood in the center of it all, calm and composed, her attention fixed on the elevator display rather than the people around her. Courtney interpreted that silence as uncertainty. In her mind, the situation was simple. A woman who clearly did not belong on the executive floor was attempting to access a restricted meeting area. The fact that Nyla remained polite only made Courtney more convinced she was correct. "I am afraid I cannot allow you upstairs without proper authorization," Courtney said. Her voice remained professional, but there was a firmness underneath it that left little room for discussion. Nyla looked at her. And what would qualify as proper authorization? The question was sincere. Courtney hesitated for a moment. Not because she lacked an answer, but because she had not expected one. "Executive credentials," she replied. "Or confirmation from someone in senior leadership." Several employees nearby nodded as though a final judgment had just been delivered. One man chuckled softly. Another whispered something that triggered another round of laughter. Nyla heard every word. The sunlight pouring through the glass walls illuminated faces, expressions, and reactions with remarkable clarity. Yet she remained completely still. She did not defend herself. She did not announce who she was. She simply listened. That response puzzled one of the younger employees standing nearby. He had expected embarrassment, perhaps frustration. Instead, he saw patience. The contrast made him increasingly uncomfortable. Courtney took a small step forward. "If you tell me who invited you, I can contact them." Nyla smiled gently. "That will not be necessary." The answer immediately reinforced every assumption Courtney had already made. Around the lobby, conversations slowed. The audience had grown larger than anyone realized. Employees arriving from elevators paused briefly before continuing toward their departments. A few lingered longer than necessary. Human curiosity often worked that way. People sensed tension and wanted to witness its outcome. One woman near the reception desk folded her arms and shook her head. "I do not know why people make things harder than they need to be." The comment was directed toward Nyla. Courtney nodded slightly. "Exactly." For the first time all morning, a faint disappointment crossed Nyla's face. Not because of the comments, not because of the laughter, because she was quietly observing the culture she had been hired to lead. The behavior unfolding around her revealed more than any employee survey ever could. Respect seemed conditional. Assumptions appeared common. People followed the tone set by those in authority. Those observations settled into her mind one by one. Then something changed. The elevator display reached the ground floor. A soft chime echoed through the lobby. The silver doors began to slide open. Almost instantly, conversations stopped. Employees straightened their posture. Smiles disappeared. Even Courtney turned toward the elevators. Because everyone recognized who was about to step into the lobby. Graham Whitmore emerged from the elevator with several board members beside him. The chairman rarely appeared on the main floor without a reason. His presence alone commanded attention. Courtney immediately smiled and prepared to greet him. Around the lobby, employees stood taller and adjusted their clothing. But before anyone could speak, Graham's eyes moved across the crowd searching for someone. And when he did not immediately see the person he expected, concern appeared on his face. Then he asked a question that caused the entire lobby to fall silent. "Has anyone seen Ms. Nyla Prescott?" For a moment, nobody answered. The question seemed to hang in the air above the lobby, suspended between confusion and realization. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked toward Graham Whitmore. Others looked toward one another. Nearly everyone assumed the person he was searching for had not arrived yet. Courtney stepped forward immediately, eager to help. "We have not seen her yet," she said confidently. "We have been preparing everything for the introduction." Graham's expression tightened slightly. "That is strange." He glanced at his watch. She arrived 15 minutes ago. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the crowd. Several employees looked toward the entrance doors. Others checked their phones. Courtney frowned. Perhaps she went directly upstairs. Graham slowly shook his head. "No. She told me she was entering through the main lobby." Silence followed. The sunlight streaming through the towering windows seemed brighter now, illuminating every face gathered near the reception area. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator door opened and closed. Nobody paid attention. Every eye remained fixed on the chairman. Graham scanned the lobby once more. Then his gaze stopped. Not on Courtney. Not on the employees clustered around the reception desk. On Nyla, standing quietly a few feet away with her canvas tote bag resting against her shoulder. A warm smile immediately appeared on his face. Relief followed. Then recognition. There you are. The words were simple, yet they changed everything. The crowd instinctively turned toward Nyla. Courtney felt her stomach tighten. Graham walked directly across the marble floor toward her. The board members accompanying him followed without hesitation. Every step seemed louder than the last. Employees watched in complete silence. Nyla smiled. "Good morning, Graham." The familiarity of the greeting struck the room like a sudden shift in gravity. Nobody called the chairman by his first name. Yet the exchange sounded natural, comfortable, and entirely expected between them. Graham extended his hand. "I am glad you made it." Nyla shook it. "The welcome has certainly been memorable." For a brief second, Graham looked confused. Then he noticed the expressions surrounding them. The nervous faces. The lowered eyes. The uncomfortable silence. His smile faded slightly as he began to understand. Courtney could feel the realization spreading through the lobby. The comments. The laughter. The assumptions. Every moment from the last 15 minutes suddenly returned with painful clarity. The young analyst who had laughed earlier stared at the floor. Another employee quietly stepped backward. Nobody wanted to be noticed now. Graham looked at Nyla carefully. "Has there been a problem?" Nyla considered the question. She could have described everything. Every comment. Every judgment. Every assumption. Instead, she simply glanced around the lobby. "I think I learned a great deal about the company this morning." The answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Several employees visibly shifted their weight. Courtney felt heat rise into her face. Because she understood exactly what Nyla meant. Graham followed her gaze across the crowd. The chairman had spent decades leading organizations. He recognized discomfort when he saw it. He also recognized disappointment. For several seconds nobody spoke. The building felt unusually quiet despite hundreds of people working throughout its floors. Then Graham nodded slowly. "Perhaps that lesson will prove valuable." Nyla returned a calm smile. "I believe it already has." Around them the atmosphere continued changing. Assumptions were disappearing. Certainty was collapsing. And for the first time that morning, many of the employees gathered in the lobby began wondering not who Nyla Prescott was, but what she would think of them after everything they had revealed about themselves before ever learning who she truly was. The lobby remained completely silent. The usual sounds of conversations, ringing phones and footsteps seemed distant now, swallowed by the weight of a single realization. Nyla Prescott stood beside Graham Whitmore beneath the sunlight pouring through the towering glass walls, while dozens of employees stared at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to embarrassment. Only minutes earlier, many of them had been laughing. Now nobody seemed capable of finding the right words. Graham slowly turned toward the crowd. "Everyone," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably authoritative, "I would like you to meet your new chief executive officer." The words settled over the lobby like a wave. Some employees lowered their eyes immediately. Others simply stood frozen. A young analyst who had joined the laughter earlier felt his stomach sink. Near the reception desk, Courtney Hale could barely process what she had just heard. Every assumption she had made that morning collapsed at once. The practical jacket. The canvas tote bag. The calm demeanor. She had interpreted all of it as evidence that Nyla did not belong. The truth had been standing directly in front of her the entire time. Graham continued speaking. After an extensive national search, the board unanimously selected Ms. Prescott to lead this company into its next chapter. Several board members nodded behind him. The respect in their expressions was impossible to miss. Nyla was not simply another executive. She was someone they trusted deeply. Someone they admired. Someone whose leadership had already transformed organizations across the country. Courtney felt the room spinning around her. Every comment she had allowed. Every assumption she had reinforced. Every opportunity she had missed to show kindness. The memory of each moment replayed itself with painful clarity. Graham stepped slightly aside and gestured toward Nyla. Her accomplishments speak for themselves, but what impressed us most was her character. The irony was impossible to ignore. Character was precisely what most people in the lobby had failed to recognize. Nyla looked across the crowd. She saw embarrassment, regret, discomfort, but she also saw something else. Reflection. For the first time that morning, people were questioning their own judgments. That mattered more than humiliation ever could. "Thank you, Graham," she said softly. Her voice carried through the lobby without effort. Everyone listened. "Before today, many of you had never met me." She paused briefly. "And before today, I had never met most of you." The silence deepened. Sunlight reflected across the marble floor as employees stood motionless. "Leadership is not about titles," Nyla continued. "It is about how people treat one another when they believe there is nothing to gain." Several employees visibly swallowed. Others looked down. Nobody interrupted. Nobody could. The truth was too clear. Courtney felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Not from fear. From understanding. Nyla was offering a lesson instead of a punishment. Compassion instead of retaliation. That choice made the moment even more powerful. Graham glanced toward the executive elevators. The board members waited quietly nearby. The formal introduction upstairs was scheduled to begin in minutes. Yet nobody seemed eager to move. The lobby itself had become the most important meeting room in the building. Because before anyone discussed strategy, revenue, or growth, an entire company had just received its first lesson from the leader who would guide its future. And the lesson had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with humanity. Courtney Hale felt as though the entire lobby had disappeared around her. The sunlight still poured through the towering glass walls. Employees still stood scattered across the marble floor. Yet all she could think about were the choices she had made over the last 15 minutes. The comments she had ignored. The assumptions she had embraced. The confidence she had placed in appearances rather than facts. Across the room, Nyla stood beside Graham Whitmore speaking briefly with members of the board. Despite everything that had happened, her posture remained relaxed and approachable. There was no sign of anger, no sign of triumph. That somehow made Courtney feel even worse. If Nyla had been furious, it would have been easier to understand. Instead, she remained gracious. Slowly, Courtney stepped forward. The movement drew the attention of several employees nearby. Nobody spoke. They watched in silence as she approached the woman she had spent the morning misjudging. When Courtney finally stopped a few feet away, she took a breath. "Miss Prescott." Nyla turned toward her immediately. "Yes." The simple response carried no hostility. Courtney lowered her eyes for a moment. Finding the right words suddenly felt difficult. "I owe you an apology." The lobby remained silent. Employees who had begun drifting back toward their departments stopped again. Graham folded his hands quietly and watched. Courtney continued. "I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you. I allowed those assumptions to influence how I treated you. And I allowed others to do the same." Her voice wavered slightly. "There is no excuse for that." For a few seconds nobody moved. The only sound came from the distant hum of elevators moving through the building. Nyla listened without interruption. Courtney looked up again. "I am sorry." The words were simple. Honest. Real. Nyla studied her expression for a moment. She could see embarrassment there. Regret. But she could also see something more important. Understanding. Growth often began when people became willing to examine their own behavior honestly. "Thank you for saying that," Nyla replied. Courtney nodded. "I understand if you no longer trust me." A faint smile appeared on Nyla's face. Trust is built through actions. The answer was neither rejection nor immediate forgiveness. It was something better. It was an opportunity. Courtney felt a small wave of relief. Around them, several employees seemed to relax as well. Nyla looked across the lobby. Many of the people who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact. Others appeared genuinely remorseful. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one she had encountered when she first walked through the doors. "Every organization reflects the choices people make each day," Nyla said. Her voice carried naturally through the quiet space. "The good news is that every day offers another chance to choose differently." Employees listened carefully. Nobody looked distracted now. Nobody seemed interested in checking phones or whispering to coworkers. The lesson had become personal. Graham smiled slightly. This was one of the reasons the board had selected her. Not because she could identify problems, because she could transform them into opportunities for growth. Sunlight continued reflecting across the marble floor. As the tension slowly faded from the room, people began seeing one another differently. Not through titles, not through appearances, through character. And as the executive team prepared to head upstairs for the formal leadership presentation, many employees realized something unexpected. The most important speech of the day had already happened right there in the lobby, and it had not required a stage, a microphone, or a prepared presentation. It had required only honesty, humility, and the willingness to learn. Late that afternoon, the executive conference room overlooked a city glowing beneath the golden light of the setting sun. The formal introduction had ended hours earlier. Presentations had been given. Questions had been answered. Employees had filled the room beyond capacity, listening more carefully than they ever had before. Yet the moment most people remembered was not the announcement itself. It was what had happened downstairs. Nyla stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office on the top floor. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Cars moved along distant streets. Office lights flickered on one building at a time. The reflection staring back at her looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same practical jacket. The same canvas tote bag resting beside her desk. The same woman. Only the perspective around her had changed. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Courtney stepped inside. Her posture was different now. Less certain. More thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Nyla turned from the window. "For what?" Courtney glanced toward the skyline. "For giving people room to learn instead of giving them reasons to be afraid." The answer lingered between them. Nyla smiled softly. Fear changes behavior for a moment. Understanding changes it for much longer. Courtney nodded. She seemed to carry that thought with her as she quietly left the office. The door closed. Silence returned. Down below, employees finished their workday. Some headed toward elevators. Others gathered their belongings and prepared for the evening. Many of them carried a lesson home with them. Not a lesson about leadership titles or corporate strategy. A lesson about assumptions. About respect. About how easily people could misunderstand someone when they focused on appearances instead of character. In the lobby, the marble floors reflected the warm glow of the sunset. The same space that had echoed with laughter that morning now felt calm. Reflective. Different. A young analyst paused near the reception desk before leaving for the day. He looked around for a moment, remembering his own reaction earlier. Then he quietly held the door open for a maintenance worker pushing a supply cart. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, yet meaningful. Change often began that way, not with grand speeches, with ordinary choices. Upstairs, Graham Whitmore stood outside the executive office for a moment before continuing toward the elevator. Through the glass wall, he could see Nyla standing by the window. A small smile crossed his face. The board had chosen the right leader. Not because she commanded authority, because she understood people. As the evening sunlight slowly faded across the skyline, Nyla picked up her tote bag and switched off the office lights. The room dimmed except for the final golden reflections shining through the glass. She took one last look across the city before heading toward the door. Tomorrow would bring meetings, decisions, and responsibilities. But today had already accomplished something important. An organization had seen itself clearly. The elevator doors opened. Nyla stepped inside. The doors closed softly behind her. Down in the lobby, the final rays of sunlight stretched across the marble floor and slowly disappeared. No applause remained. No speeches echoed through the building. Only a quiet understanding settled over the headquarters. And in that silence, the lesson endured. Respect people before you know their title. Respect them before you know their position. Respect them before you know what they can do for you. Because character is often standing right in front of you long before you recognize its value.